The DOJ has indicted a company that runs elections in numerous countries for an approximately $182 million bribery scheme, which means every government using its system is now exposed to a criminal defendant. The DOJ has named Smartmatic, not just its executives, as a criminal defendant in a federal indictment tied to approximately $182 million in Philippine election contracts. Smartmatic holds election infrastructure agreements across numerous countries. The October 2025 superseding indictment charged the company itself under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Corporate liability now attaches to the operational entity. Most coverage focused on the named individuals. But the structurally significant element is the corporate indictment, because corporate criminal liability follows the company into every jurisdiction where it holds contracts, not just the individuals who face trial. If your institution holds contracts with a vendor under federal criminal indictment and no public framework exists for what a conviction triggers contractually, that is a live governance exposure your vendor risk policy may not address. Smartmatic is not a consumer product. It is election infrastructure. The company provides voting technology, software platforms, and election management systems to governments. Its contracts are not commercial transactions. They are sovereign agreements governing how votes are counted and certified. Governments contracted with Smartmatic because its global footprint signaled institutional legitimacy. A vendor operating across numerous jurisdictions with a track record of major national elections carries an implicit credibility premium that simplified procurement due diligence. But the DOJ superseding indictment of October 2025 adds the company itself as a criminal defendant alongside named executives. The indictment alleges that Smartmatic's leadership paid bribes to officials at the Philippine Commission on Elections to secure contracts worth approximately $182 million. Therefore, the legitimacy signal used to approve Smartmatic was not incidental to the alleged scheme. According to the DOJ, it was the mechanism through which the scheme operated. The company that counts votes across numerous countries is now a criminal defendant in a U.S. federal court. Here is what most analysis missed. When prosecutors charge individual executives, the company retains operational continuity. Executives are replaced. The institution continues. Contracts remain active. Licensing remains intact. The corporate entity survives. But when the DOJ charges the company itself, the liability architecture changes fundamentally. Under the respondeat superior doctrine, a corporation is criminally liable for acts committed by employees within the scope of their employment. The company does not need to have authorized the bribery, only to have employed those who committed it and benefited. Therefore, corporate criminal exposure is not bounded by the individuals. It follows the institution into every contract, jurisdiction, licensing agreement, and government relationship. Operationally, this introduces potential debarment from government contracting, contract termination triggers tied to criminal status, licensing consequences where legal standing is required, and reputational effects that do not wait for a verdict. This is not theoretical. It is a pending legal determination that every institution holding a Smartmatic contract is now tracking. If convicted, this is not a fine. It is a question of whether governments can keep using the system. Smartmatic's global footprint was treated as legitimacy, but the DOJ indictment reframes that footprint as the mechanism through which the alleged bribery scaled. Therefore, the reputation was not incidental. It was the product being sold to the next government. ScamBeast analyzes corporate fraud patterns and governance failures using primary regulatory sources. The second question most coverage did not answer is jurisdictional. The alleged bribery occurred in the Philippines. Smartmatic is not a U.S. company in the traditional sense. So how does a U.S. federal indictment reach this case? The DOJ didn't just charge the executives, it charged the company. That distinction matters, and most coverage missed it. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act establishes U.S. jurisdiction over bribery of foreign officials when a U.S. nexus exists. That nexus does not require the act to occur on U.S. soil. It requires only a connection to U.S. jurisdiction, incorporation, banking infrastructure, or commerce. Smartmatic USA Corp., the entity named, provides that nexus. The alleged bribery occurred in the Philippines. The DOJ's reach extends through the U.S. registered entity that allegedly benefited. But this is not novel enforcement. The DOJ has applied the FCPA to companies operating primarily outside the U.S. when a nexus exists. The principle is established. What changes here is the institutional profile. Therefore, the Smartmatic indictment is not a jurisdictional anomaly. It is a standard enforcement application to a company whose role, election infrastructure with sovereign contracts, amplifies the institutional consequences. The FCPA has been used against companies operating outside U.S. borders before. Here is how the jurisdictional logic works, and why it matters. Any company with U.S. incorporation, banking usage, or commerce exposure falls within FCPA jurisdiction. The boundary is not location, it is nexus. The Smartmatic indictment creates a governance problem beyond the company. Governments that contracted with Smartmatic now face a vendor risk scenario with no publicly available resolution framework. The trial is scheduled for January 2027. Until then, and potentially beyond, Smartmatic remains a criminal defendant while contracts remain active. As of the date of this episode, no major contracting government has publicly defined what a conviction would trigger. No standard, contractual framework has been publicly adopted. No international election monitoring body has issued guidance for institutions operating under this condition. This is not speculative, it is the absence of a response framework. The trial is set for January 2027. Governments are watching and have not stated what happens if the verdict goes the wrong way. Therefore, the exposure extends beyond Smartmatic. It reaches procurement officers, compliance directors, and governance bodies that approve these contracts, without a defined contingency for a change in legal status. The election contract bribery system describes the mechanism. Legitimacy is built through contract wins that allegedly required bribery. That legitimacy then validates future contracts. The system scales through manufactured trust. But the indictment does not resolve the governance question. A verdict determines liability. It does not retroactively audit the procurement systems that relied on that legitimacy. For procurement, compliance, and risk professionals, the case presents a defined question. If a vendor under federal criminal indictment holds active contracts, what does your policy specify? Does it define triggers for indictment, for conviction? Does it require escalation to boards or oversight bodies? Most frameworks were not designed for a sovereign-level vendor under active criminal charges while contracts continue. That gap is not yet a failure. It becomes one if unaddressed. The reputation was the product. That is the governance signal surfaced here. The DOJ indictment remains unresolved. Smartmatic has entered a not guilty plea. Trial is set for January 2027. No verdict has been reached. No contractual consequences have been publicly triggered. What exists is a live federal criminal case against a company operating election infrastructure across numerous countries under a statute with established cross-border reach, with corporate liability that does not terminate with individual outcomes. Follow Scam Beast for continued analysis of enforcement and governance risk systems.